afternoon, everybody, and welcome to a
conversation. Now, there are not many historians who would be put on the main stage of the Congress Center of the World Economic Forum, but Yuval Harari has written two very important books which have really shaped the debate, not just inside governments, but inside many businesses and many non-governmental organizations too. But what he's going to be talking about today is something that actually Chancellor Merkel touched on in her own speech, which is a question of data. And what do we do about data today? His ideas are very provocative, very alarming, and something that all of you should pay very close attention to now. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I thought I would bring that perspective to the topic today, is the issue of pandemic preparedness. And if there's one message that I want to leave with you today, based on my experience, and you'll see that in a moment, is that there is no question that there will be a challenge to the coming administration in the arena of infectious diseases, both chronic infectious diseases in the sense of already ongoing disease, and we have certainly a large burden of that, but also there will be a surprise outbreak. And I hope by the end of my relatively short presentation, you will understand why history, the history of the last 32 years that I've been the director of NIAID, will tell the next administration that there's no doubt in anyone's mind that they will be faced with the challenges that their predecessors were faced with.
I will tell you, Director Deutsch, as a former Los Angeles police narcotics detective, that the agency has dealt drugs throughout this country for a long time.
All right, obviously that is an answer for a lot of you. Now can you please?
I refer...
All right, now can you please?
I refer direct...
Wait a minute. Wait a minute here. Wait a minute. If you don't like what's going on here, please leave now. Leave now, because there are others who do want to hear what's going on in this room. Will you please take your seats? I will come back to you as we roll back across to the center section.
Director Deutsch, I will refer you to three specific agency operations known as Amadeus, Pegasus, and Watchtower. I have Watchtower documents heavily redacted by the agency. I was personally exposed to CIA operations and recruited by CIA personnel who attempted to recruit me in the late 70s to become involved in protecting agency drug operations in this country. I have been trying to get this out for 18 years, and I have the evidence. My question for you is very specific, sir.
So for those who think that infectious diseases is gone, there's so many people who've made foolhardy statements not knowing at the time that they made them. I usually show a quote from an old Surgeon General or an old pundit in infectious disease. So I thought I'd pull this one out from Sir Macfarlane Burnet, who was actually a Nobel Prize-winning immunologist, who made the statement, as many did, to write about infectious diseases is almost to write of something that has passed into history. The most likely forecast about the future of infectious diseases is that it will be very dull, which is really kind of interesting coming from a semi-genius like Macfarlane Burnet. And I think what he did, and the mistake that so many people have made, is something that several of our panelists have already referred to. And that is a failure to look beyond our own borders in the issue of the globality of health issues. Not only things that are there that will come here, but surprises that we have. So when I think about infectious diseases, I break it down into a few buckets. The established infectious diseases that we know, and when I say I know, we mean that you could reasonably predict today what the disease burden of morbidity and mortality is going to be next year. In my mind, that's the Tony definition of an established infectious disease.
Of our species, and really the future of life. We are probably one of the last generations of Homo sapiens. Within a century or two, Earth will be dominated by entities that are more different from us than we are different from Neanderthals or from chimpanzees. Because in the coming generations, we will learn how to engineer bodies and brains and minds. These will be the main products of the economy, of the 21st century economy. Not textiles and vehicles and weapons, but bodies and brains and minds. Now, how exactly will the future masters of the planet look like?
But there are also other issues that we're talking about now, are diseases that are brand new, that we've never seen them before, or much more common, diseases that re-emerge. So let's take a very quick look at established infectious disease and show you what I mean. So there are diseases and disease burden, and these are projected every year, and they're almost always right. For example, lower respiratory infections, and these are deaths. There's going to be over 2.5 million deaths. There are about 1.6 to 1.8 million deaths of tuberculosis, hepatitis B and hepatitis C, diarrheal diseases. It is of note that I have HIV/AIDS here on an established infectious disease. When I was giving this lecture, and I'm going to get to it in a moment, it was an emerging infectious disease. And now, after 35 years and 6 months, it is an established infectious disease. So let's take a look at the burden, and then we'll quickly go on to the emerging.
The question for you is very specific, sir. If in the course of the IG's investigations and Fred Hitz's work, you come across evidence of severely criminal activity,
Let him speak into
and
the
it's
mic.
classified, will you use that classification to hide the criminal activity, or will you tell the American people the truth?
All right, you want to hear the response first from Congressman Julian Dixon and then from the director. Wait a minute. From your, I'm sorry, sir. I will allow the director to speak first and then Congressman Julian Dixon.
If you have information about CIA illegal activity in drugs, you should immediately bring that information to wherever you want, but let me suggest 3 places. The Los Angeles Police Department,
I'm sorry, others want to hear this answer. I am sorry, others want to hear this answer.
it is your choice.
Bodies and brains and minds. These will be the main products of the economy, of the 21st century economy. Not textiles and vehicles and weapons, but bodies and brains and minds. Now, how exactly will the future masters of the planet look like?
The Los Angeles Police Department, the Inspector General, or office of one of your Congress persons from this.
18 years ago, sir, and I got shot at for it.
Wait a minute, sir. Wait a minute, sir.
And
Sir, you have not gotten the mic yet. You are not. But wait a minute, then don't speak out of turn.
let me say something else.
So by the last count of that article that came out in Lancet just this past year, if you look at the total of 56 million deaths worldwide each year, about 15% of them are infectious diseases. That used to be 27% when I first started giving this lecture. And what that tells us is some of the advances we've made in vaccinations and antibiotics and what have you. But if you look regionally, it is still the #1 cause of DALYs, which is disability-adjusted life years, which is death plus disability in the developing world in individuals from birth to 49 years old. So it still is a major problem. So that's established infectious diseases. But now we're talking about what an administration might face in regard to emerging diseases. And I'm going to just put them together into newly and re-emerging diseases, and I'll get in a second to what I mean. So from my own personal experiences, why I can say with some confidence that history tells us that we will definitely get surprised in the next few years. So it all started for me when I became director of NIAID, and that was in 1984. And this is the NIH record showing this young immunologist who just took over as the director of NIAID. And over the years from then, as you've heard in the introduction, I've had the opportunity to serve 5 and advise 5 presidents.
This will be decided by the people who own the data. Those who control the data control the future not just of humanity, but the future of life itself.
5 presidents. And these are the 5 presidents, and I'm going to go into the things that I had to advise them about.
If this information turns up wrongdoing, we will bring the people to justice and make them accountable.
Because today, data is the most important asset in the world. In ancient times, land was the most important asset. And if too much land became concentrated in too few hands, humanity split into aristocrats and commoners.
At the time, we thought this was an American gay disease. We did not know that as we were talking about these 2 MMWRs, there were likely hundreds of thousands of people in sub-Saharan Africa who were already infected, but nobody noticed it. This was something that actually changed my career, and I talk about it often because as an infectious disease immunologist at the time, I said to myself, this is going to be really, really bad. And I try to get people interested in it, and very few people did, with some exceptions. The CDC certainly was. We were up here. So what I did is I tried to give, I refer to it as my apologia pro vita sua. I could say that in Georgetown because you all take Latin, right? Okay. Which is really an explanation for what you're doing with your life. So I wrote an article and sent it into the New England Journal of Medicine. They rejected it because they said it was too alarmist.
I thought you did not want to be here, but now that you are here, please let us hear and listen. Thank you very much.
Sir, I want to thank you for coming. You were at the last meeting. The staff probably had the spelling of your name wrong, but we would like to talk to you. We have been looking for a couple of days for you, and we want to make sure that you contact the committee, because obviously you have some valuable information. If you want to give it to me privately, if you want to hand it to that aide where I can contact you this evening, please do it. Don't let us get away without getting a contact from you.
Thank you, sir.
Pass it up to him now so everyone can see that I got it. That would be fine.
Thank you, sir. And for the record, Mike.
Please keep the noise down so that we can hear and we can get answers.
Then in the modern age, in the last 2 centuries, machinery replaced land as the most important asset. And if too many of the machines became concentrated in too few hands, humanity split into classes, into capitalists and proletariats. Now data is replacing machinery as the most important asset, and if too much of the data becomes concentrated in too few hands, humanity will split not into classes, it will split into species, into different species.
You know, we've been quite successful with HIV/AIDS. Perhaps there are implications for other infectious diseases of global health importance. And what are the lessons that we learned from HIV? One, you have to commit substantial financial and human resources. These things don't get addressed spontaneously by themselves. You have to enlist the best and the brightest investigators in both basic and clinical research. You have to involve the community, be it the gay community in the United States or the community in Africa and West Africa when we dealt with Ebola, or the people in South America when we're dealing with Zika.
Now, why is data so important? It's important because we've reached the point when we can hack not just computers, we can hack human beings and other organisms. There is a lot of talk these days about hacking computers and email accounts and bank accounts and mobile phones, but actually we are gaining the ability to hack human beings. Now, what do you need in order to hack a human being? You need two things. You need a lot of computing power, and you need a lot of data, especially biometric data. Not data about what I buy or where I go, but data about what is happening inside my body and inside my brain. Until today, nobody had the necessary computing power and the necessary data to hack humanity. Even if the Soviet KGB or the Spanish Inquisition followed you around everywhere, 24 hours a day, watching everything you do, listening to everything you say, still, they didn't have the computing power and the biological knowledge necessary to make sense of what was happening inside your body and brain and to understand how you feel and what you think and what you want. But this is now changing because of two simultaneous revolutions. On the one hand, advances in computer science, and especially the rise of machine learning and AI, are giving us the necessary computing power.
You have to have cross-sector collaboration. You can't do it alone. The CDC can't do it alone. The NIH can't do it alone. You do it with all of us, with industry, with global organizations, with philanthropy and NGOs, and you got to get the leaders and the policymakers involved. Those are the principles we learned, and we applied them. So from an NIH perspective, and I have to take that because that's where I'm coming from, these are the things that we get involved with: basic and clinical research, genomics, expansion of research capacity, like we did in West Africa and Liberia, the way the CDC did in Sierra Leone, the way INSERM did in Guinea, ultimately to develop countermeasures. So let's get back to my map now and take a look at it. I mentioned that there was also the trickling of dengue in the Americas, because remember, dengue is an Asian African disease, and it came in under the radar screen, but now we're really addressing it. And so when you look at dengue, right now we have our sights on dengue. They're very much the same way as we're doing with Zika. And actually, this is a release from just this spring in which we now have an experimental stage, a phase 3 clinical trial. We have an approved dengue vaccine that we need to do better on because it's only about 60-some-odd% effective. So we really want to get one that's up in the 85 and 90%. So that was George H.W. Bush.
And at the same time, advances in biology, and especially in brain science, are giving us the necessary understanding, biological understanding. You can really summarize 150 years of biological research since Charles Darwin in 3 words: organisms are algorithms. This is the big insight of the modern life sciences.
Then things started to heat up a bit when we got to President Clinton, because he had to deal with HIV. It wasn't going away. But now we had some other things: West Nile, H5N1, antibiotic resistance. we go back to the same paradigm of the things you need to do. You need to do basic research. The CDC does public health. The WHO does what they do, and you wind up with countermeasures. And let me take a look with you at some of the things we had to deal with and some of the briefings of those 200-plus briefings that we had to do. One was West Nile. West Nile is re-emerging. It isn't new. It was in Africa and the Middle East likely for hundreds of years. Then either a mosquito, a bird, or a person got on a plane in Israel and landed at Kennedy Airport, and then, boom, we now have West Nile, which is endemic in the United States. So what are we going to do about it? We're going to develop countermeasures, such as vaccines. Now, it's very interesting. When we first started to develop a West Nile vaccine, we had a successful vaccine. It was safe. It induced a good immune response. We couldn't find a company to partner with us to develop it in an advanced way.
That organisms, whether viruses or bananas or humans, they are really just biochemical algorithms. And we are learning how to decipher these algorithms. Now, when the two revolutions merge, when the infotech revolution merges with the biotech revolution, what you get is the ability to hack human beings. And maybe the most important invention for the merger of infotech and biotech is the biometric sensor that translates biochemical processes in the body and the brain into electronic signals that a computer can store and analyze.
That is not the case now with Zika, since there are a number of companies that are very interested in that. Then there's the issue of antimicrobial resistance, which we have gotten very deeply involved with, up to and including the current president who gave an executive order. So I don't want to jump ahead of myself, but these are not things that just stay with one administration. They spill over into the other. So we first in earnest started to see it back then, so we really addressed it, as we've done in so many other things. Then came George W. Bush. Again, HIV/AIDS was still prominent, but he had to deal with something that was really brand new here: anthrax, the beginning of H5N1, and SARS. Now, when you talk about presidents worrying that when they get into office, there's going to be something they have to deal with, some health issue that's going to be very disconcerting, well, it was a double whammy for George W. Bush, because not only did we have the terrible events of 9/11, but juxtaposed in the fall, in October, right after the 9/11 issues, we had the anthrax attacks. And then all of a sudden, a new outbreak that a president and the departments had to deal with was bioterrorism.
And once you have enough such biometric information and enough computing power, you can create algorithms that know me better than I know myself. And humans really don't know themselves very well.
The country took this very seriously. There were strategic plans for the Category A agents, namely agents that we knew had been stockpiled by the Soviet Union before the fall of the Iron Curtain. Those were smallpox, anthrax, botulism. So I had the opportunity of dealing very closely with President George W. Bush and his staff in dealing with how we're going to address bioterrorism. And I had a very interesting experience, which I'll always treasure. We were going up to Pittsburgh together with the president, with D.A. Henderson, with Secretary Thompson and others, to look at a new facility for modeling the possibility of a bioterror attack. So I had the privilege of being on Air Force One, and the president called me up to his compartment and said, "Tony, what scares you most about potential microbial attacks?" And he was talking about a terrorist. And I told him, I said, "Mr. President, I worry more about the natural occurrence of an influenza pandemic and the ongoing plague of HIV than I do about a bioterror attack."
This is why algorithms have a real chance of getting to know ourselves better. We don't really know ourselves. To give an example, when I was 21, I finally realized that I was gay after living for several years in denial. And this is not exceptional. A lot of gay men live in denial for many years. They don't know something very important about themselves. Now imagine the situation in 10 or 20 years when an algorithm can tell any teenager exactly where he or she is on the gay-straight spectrum, and even how malleable this position is. The algorithm tracks your eye movements, your blood pressure, your brain activity, and tells you who you are. Now, maybe you personally wouldn't like to make use of such an algorithm. But maybe you find yourself in some boring birthday party of somebody from your class at school, and one of your friends has this wonderful idea that I've just heard about this cool new algorithm that tells you your sexual orientation, and wouldn't it be a lot of fun if everybody just takes turns testing themselves on this algorithm as everybody else is watching and commenting? What would you do? Would you just walk away? And even if you walk away, and even if you keep hiding from your classmates or from yourself, you will not be able to hide from Amazon and Alibaba and the secret police. As you surf the internet, as you watch videos or check your social feed, the algorithms will be monitoring your eye movements, your blood pressure, your brain activity, and they will know. They could tell Coca-Cola that if you want to sell this person some fuzzy, sugary drink, don't use the advertisement with the shirtless girl. Use the advertisement with the shirtless guy.
That doesn't mean you want to diminish a bioterror attack, but it does mean that you have to pay attention to the natural causes. And with regard to HIV, in his presidency, as we all know, the president did something that is historic. He established PEPFAR in his State of the Union address in January of 2003 and announced a program which initially was $15 billion to prevent 7 million HIV infections, treat 2 million HIV-infected individuals, and care for 10 million, which turns out now unequivocally to be the most important global health endeavor that has ever been established in history with regard to any single disease.
You wouldn't even know that this was happening, but they will know, and this information will be worth billions. Once we have algorithms that can understand me better than I understand myself, they could predict my desires, manipulate my emotions, and even take decisions on my behalf. And if we are not careful, the outcome might be the rise of digital dictatorships.
Now, getting back to nature being a bioterrorist, all of a sudden, everybody started to notice that, and the first hint we got about that, and this was still during the George W. Bush administration, was bird flu, H5N1. It emerged in 4 Asian countries. It then jumped into humans in a very ineffective way. Bill Steiger's up there. He and I took a trip to Southeast Asia with Secretary Leavitt to take a look at what was going on there. And the administration took this very seriously. They invested over $7 billion to prepare us for bird flu. So just the way you had the bioterror strategic plan, all of a sudden we had a pandemic influenza strategic plan, which is actually in effect right now. We still work through that plan. The CDC, the FDA, the NIH, we all use that plan.
In the 20th century, democracy generally outperformed dictatorship because democracy was better at processing data and making decisions. We are used to thinking about democracy and dictatorship in ethical or political terms, but actually, these are two different methods to process information. Democracy processes information in a distributed way. It distributes the information and the power to make decisions between many institutions and individuals. Dictatorship, on the other hand, concentrates all the information and power in one place. Now, given the technological conditions of the 20th century, distributed data processing worked better than centralized data processing, which is one of the main reasons why democracy outperformed dictatorship, and why, for example, the US economy outperformed the Soviet economy.
And again, getting back to the things that we did with the diagnostics, the therapeutics, we started to develop a vaccine. And we preemptively made a vaccine for H5N1, and we put it in the strategic national stockpile, the same way as we have one for H7N9. We haven't had to use it yet, but the idea of having something ready to go originated way back during the H5N1 days. But we really decided we needed to do better with our technology. So we advanced from egg-based to cell-based to finally recombinant DNA technologies. And we're continuing to develop better vaccine platforms. So if that wasn't enough, then SARS came along. Now the thing about SARS really scared us because it came on and it came on very fulminantly. It started off in China, went to Hong Kong. You all know the story. It's an epidemiologist's delight. I mean, if you want to specialize in epidemiology, you just got to read this, and if you have any children you want them to go into epidemiology, tell them the SARS story. They'll all go into epidemiology. And it was someone who went to a hotel in Hong Kong. 19 people in that hotel got on planes and went to different parts of the world. And then we had the SARS outbreak, 8,000 cases, almost 800 deaths. Not only was it a public health issue, it was an economic issue. This is a picture of a near-empty flight from Hong Kong to Beijing in May 2003. It really put everything to a halt economically, including in Canada, because Canada had a big problem. So what did we do? Right then again, we jumped on with new technologies, because now we have rapid sequencing. You don't have to grow the virus. You can rapidly sequence it. And we wound up developing a SARS vaccine that we, again, never had to use. And the reason we didn't have to use it, because the public health measures completely put the lid on it. So here's an example of public health measures that are antiquated, if you want to call it that, working perfectly in stopping an outbreak.
But this is true only under the unique technological conditions of the 20th century. In the 21st century, new technological revolutions, especially AI and machine learning, might swing the pendulum in the opposite direction. They might make centralized data processing far more efficient than distributed data processing. And if democracy cannot adapt to these new conditions, then humans will come to live under the rule of digital dictatorships. And already at present, we are seeing the formation of more and more sophisticated surveillance regimes throughout the world, not just by authoritarian regimes, but also by democratic governments. The US, for example, is building a global surveillance system, while my home country of Israel is trying to build a total surveillance regime in the West Bank. But control of data might enable human elites to do something even more radical than just build digital dictatorships. By hacking organisms, elites may gain the power to re-engineer the future of life itself. Because once you can hack something, you can usually also engineer it. And if indeed we succeed in hacking and engineering life, this will be not just the greatest revolution in the history of humanity. This will be the greatest revolution in biology since the very beginning of life 4 billion years ago.
So then we get to the present time. A lot of headaches, for this administration with regard to outbreaks. I mean, they had more than their share. There was the H1N1 pandemic right soon after the president came in. Now, remember, I know everybody in this audience is sophisticated about that. You see his presidency, 2009 to 2017. What happened in 2009 as soon as he walked in the office? The H1N1 2009 pandemic flu. That's the kind of thing that is very intimidating as well as disruptive to an administration. And then we had the other things which we'll get to, MERS, chikungunya, Ebola, Zika, AMR, back again to this. So right now, the threat of bird flu isn't just H5N1, H7N9. Even today, we're starting to see things like H5N8. So it's all over the place. So what's the answer to that? What's the best way to address that? I think most of you know what I'm going to say in the next slide, is something that we really have to get successful, and that is the development of a universal influenza vaccine, namely a vaccine that is not only effective against seasonal flu changes, but also pandemics, so that you do not have any distinguishing features between how you prepare for one or the other. And this is something that Gary Nabel and I wrote about 6 or 7 years ago when we were talking about the work that we started, and it's coming along pretty well. We don't have it yet. We're probably not going to have it for a few years, but we're getting closer and closer to a universal flu vaccine. So just as soon as we thought we got that under control, then in 2013 came chikungunya. The reason it's important, it came to the Caribbean, including Puerto Rico, which was our territories. It had never been in the Western Hemisphere before. And then all of a sudden, this is what it looked like after a while. Again, together with the CDC and the FDA, we wound up developing a chikungunya phase 2 trial vaccine, which we're doing now. So by that time, you would think that all of us involved with the CDC and the FDA and the secretaries were really kind of getting exhausted, but it gets worse.
For 4 billion years, nothing fundamental changed in the basic rules of the game of life. All of life, for 4 billion years, dinosaurs, amoebas, tomatoes, humans, all of life was subject to the laws of natural selection and to the laws of organic biochemistry. But this is now about to change. Science is replacing evolution by natural selection with evolution by intelligent design. Not the intelligent design of some god above the clouds, but our intelligent design and the intelligent design of our clouds, the IBM cloud, the Microsoft cloud. These are the new driving forces of evolution. And at the same time, science may enable life, after being confined for 4 billion years to the limited realm of organic compounds, science may enable life to break out into the inorganic realm. So after 4 billion years of organic life shaped by natural selection, we are entering the era of inorganic life shaped by intelligent design. This is why the ownership of data is so important. If we don't regulate it, a tiny elite may come to control not just the future of human societies, but the shape of life forms in the future. So how to regulate the data, the ownership of data?
Because then we wind up getting Ebola, as we all know. Ebola, which had 24 outbreaks in sub-Saharan Africa, anywhere from 2 people to 200 people, then came away in a new circumstance, which I referred to as the perfect storm. 3 countries geographically overlapping each other, very poor, disorganized, no healthcare system, crowded, and being very, very skeptical of authority. Made it extremely difficult. But after 28,000 cases and 11,000 deaths, we finally got our arms around the good public health measures as well as the research, again, that we mentioned, that Ron and Amy and others mentioned. We did a program in Liberia. The CDC did a program in Sierra Leone. The WHO did one in Guinea, and we wound up, after all was said and done, with having a vaccine, having a drug that looks promising. We haven't nailed it down yet, but also understanding a lot about the disease. Now, the only thing that put a little bit of a monkey wrench into things was one of the things that Ron and Amy had mentioned, and that is the fear associated with what happens when what's over there can come here. The fear was totally inordinate about what the reality was. Namely, when one person came, landed in Dallas, 2 nurses got infected. But what we did is that we started then something that we had been working on for years, just in case there would have been an accident where we would have to take care of somebody.
We have had 10,000 years of experience regulating the ownership of land. We have had a few centuries of experience regulating the ownership of industrial machinery. But we don't have much experience in regulating the ownership of data, which is inherently far more difficult because unlike land and unlike machinery, data is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It can move at the speed of light, and you can create as many copies of it as you want. So does the data about my DNA, my brain, my body, my life, does it belong to me or to some corporation or to the government or perhaps to the human collective? At present, big corporations are holding much of the data, and people are becoming worried about it. But mandating governments to nationalize the data may curb the power of the big corporations only in order to give rise to digital dictatorships. And politicians really, many politicians at least, are like musicians. And the instrument they play on is the human emotional and biochemical system. A politician gives a speech, and there is a wave of fear all over the country. A politician tweets, and there is an explosion of anger and hatred. Now, I don't think we should give these musicians most sophisticated instruments to play on. And I certainly don't think they are ready to be entrusted with the future of life in the universe, especially as many politicians and governments seem incapable of producing meaningful visions for the future. And instead, what they sell the public are nostalgic fantasies about going back to the past.
This is not new. This is yet again another arbovirus. But again, for epidemiology, should we have seen it coming? We know it was discovered in 47, first cases in 52, and it worked its way across the Pacific. So when it got to Yap Island with an outbreak, the outbreak essentially attenuated itself. In 2013, an outbreak in French Polynesia, and then it got to, just like with Ebola in West Africa, what I call the perfect storm. A completely immunologically naive country, Brazil, a very, very populous country, a country with an awful lot of Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, and then you had what we saw was an outbreak, which would have been inconsequential given the fact that, relatively speaking, in the big picture of diseases, Zika is not a big deal, except thanks to the good observation of the Brazilian public health officials. What they did notice was the great catastrophe of Zika, namely the extraordinary spike in microcephalic cases where kids born with microcephaly, which is just the tip of the iceberg, because we're now starting to see that the congenital Zika syndrome goes well beyond microcephaly. Again, we put into full-blown the same pattern, the basic clinical research, developing countermeasures, and now we have a situation where we have a series of vaccines, and this is a complicated slide just to tell you that 2 of them are already in phase 1 trial, the first one getting ready to go into phase 2 trial in February of this year. The first one is a DNA, the second is a Zika particle inactivated, and a company that BARDA is collaborating with, Moderna, just started their phase 1 literally yesterday or the day before.
And as a historian, I can tell you 2 things about the past. First of all, it wasn't fun. You wouldn't like to really go back there. And secondly, it's not coming back. So nostalgic fantasies really are not a solution. So who should own the data? I frankly don't know. I think the discussion has just begun. Most people, when they hear the talk about regulating data, they think about privacy, about shopping, about companies, corporations that know where I go and what I buy. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are much more important things at stake. So the discussion has hardly begun, and we cannot expect instant answers. We had better call upon our scientists, our philosophers, our lawyers, and even our poets, or especially our poets, to turn their attention to this big question. How do you regulate the ownership of data?
So what are the two approaches to end up this discussion? There are two approaches you do when you come to a situation with regard to vaccines and diagnostics. You preemptively develop pathogen-specific countermeasures. There is some merit, and I put in parenthesis, some. But that's a dangerous thing if that's all you do, because as Ron said, and as Amy said, and as others have said, if we made a list, Ebola wouldn't have been on our list, and Zika wouldn't have been on our list. So a pre-developed list has a place, but it's not the total answer. One of the things you do need to do is develop universal platforms, the way we are with vaccines, the way we're doing with diagnostics. So when you get a new microbe, you get the sequence, you insert the gene into whatever the platform is, VSV, DNA, mRNA, whatever it is much, much quicker than having to worry about going from scratch in trying to grow a microbe. What about the lessons learned? I've already said it about HIV, they're about the same. Global surveillance, these are all things that Ron and Amy and others mentioned to you during the panel. Transparency and communication, infrastructure, capacity building, coordination and collaboration, the platform technology that I mentioned, and I am very much in favor of what everyone has said here today, namely we do need a public health emergency fund. It's tough to get it for the reasons that Ron mentioned, but we need it, because what we had to go through for Zika, I mean, it was very, very painful when the president asked for the $1.9 billion in February and we didn't get it until September. That was a very painful process. Examples to develop flexible vaccine capacity, there are a lot of things going on out there. The Global Fund for Vaccine Development, the Coalition of Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI, that you may have heard of. GSK has built a facility to be able to hit the ground running, and then we have BARDA. So I'm going to end with the last slide, and that is the administration, next to last slide, the administration that is going to come in the next few days. Will there be a resurgence of Zika? We're getting into the summer of the South America. Are we going to see a resurgence or not? What about influenza? Are we going to get a new pandemic? And the third bullet is probably the most important. What about things that we're not even thinking about? But what is for sure that no matter what, history has told us definitively that it will happen, because infectious diseases, as I said 8 years ago in this article with David Morans and Greg Folkers, that it is a perpetual challenge. It is not going to go away. So the thing we're extraordinarily confident about is that we are going to see this in the next few years. Thank you.
The future, not just of humanity, but the future of life itself may depend on the answer to this question.
For the record, my name is Mike Ruppert, R-U-P-P-E-R-T. I did bring this information out 18 years ago, and I got shot at and forced out of LAPD because of it. I've been on the record for 18 years nonstop, and I'll be happy to give you, Congressman, anything that I have.
Thank you, Mr. Ruppert.
Last quick question, then we must wrap, sadly. When it was all about land control, the elites essentially had feudalism. We called it feudalism in history. When it was all about the industrial machines, we had capitalism and Marxism. Have you thought of a word to describe this new world of dataism?